Naoki Urasawa's Monster is one of the greatest and most thought-provoking anime of our age. A fact we know to be true because of the lack of people who have actually watched it. Okay, that's a lie. If we use my anime list as a metric to see how many people have actually watched the show, which we probably shouldn't, but we don't really have an alternative in this case, then we can say that out of all of the anime in existence, only 164 anime have been watched by more people. And Monster is ranked as the 40th highest, but then again, Legend of the Galactic Heroes is ranked number 5. And I can count on less than one hand the amount of people I know who can honestly say that they've watched that mammoth of a series all the way to the end. So it's not that no one has watched Monster, but rather that people just don't talk about it. Fair enough, though, because unlike other amazing shows to come out of that island in the Pacific, this is one that's not easily digestible, nor one that fits the normal criteria for becoming mainstream, unfortunate as that may be. Monster is simultaneously a series that is built around aspects counter to why many people watch anime in the first place, but that also continues a level of quality and dedication to storytelling which we rarely see in other types of media. When many people watch anime, they do so to see things fantastical. The vast majority of anime that has become household names contain some unrealistic aspects to them that set them apart from reality. A notebook that kills people, a form of magic that can morph and change matter at will, a time machine gone wrong, a guy with a superpowered cheat code for life, or, you know, just space and giant robots. That's important too. Monster contains none of these, which for many people can make it hard to recommend. While aspects of its story do contain some fantastical and inexplicable things, the vast majority of the story is either grounded in reality or, at the extreme, a facet of someone's subconscious that isn't actually real. It's just something that they believe to be real, which is almost as scary. Monster is the tale of a man, Kenzo Tenma, a brilliant neurosurgeon and immigrant from Japan living in Germany in the late 1980s. At the start of the series, he is given a choice no doctor or person in a medical profession wants to make: the choice to save a life at the cost of another. The decision that he makes influences not just his own life for the next 10 years and beyond, but also the lives of every single person now affected by his choice. Ladies, gentlemen, and others, welcome to Glass Reflection, where today we are going to be discussing an anime from 2004, produced by Studio Madhouse and based off the original work by Naoki Urasawa, Monster. Let's jam. Monster's initial premise, at its core, is the telling of a thought experiment. Reconceptualized in 1967 by philosopher Philip Foot and known commonly as the trolley problem. In this problem, you have a runaway trolley that is moving at high speed down a set of railway tracks. Ahead of it is a group of 5 people tied to the tracks, unable to move. You, an observer, are standing next to a lever. If you pull the lever, the trolley will switch to a second set of tracks, saving those 5 people. However, on the second track is another singular person also tied and unable to move. The trolley problem is a moral dilemma of choice. If you do nothing, you allow the trolley to continue its route and kill 5 people. If you pull the lever, you save the lives of those initial 5 people, but condemn the remaining person to die when they would have survived otherwise. Monster starts off its narrative with a trolley problem. Dr. Kenzo Tenma, a neurosurgeon, is presented with 2 different tracks. Down one is a child, Johan, with a gunshot wound to the head. Without Tenma's help, this boy will die in the operating room, as Tenma's fellow doctors are not up to the task of completing the complicated surgery needed to save his life. On the other track is the mayor, who arrived at the hospital just before Johan's surgery was about to start. The mayor is a very influential person to the administration of the hospital, and he is also in need of a complicated surgery that may not succeed without Tenma's help. Tenma is now massively conflicted, as he recently had to deal with a very similar problem just days before this. He allowed that decision to be made by his superiors, but was still confronted by the grieving widow of a man he was initially supposed to operate on, but did not. In a way, Tenma's superiors telling him who to save is the lever being pulled, controlling which track he is forced to go down. Without their involvement, Tenma would simply have saved the old man and this young boy, since they came to the hospital first. But due to the results of the first situation, Tenma is compelled the second time around to pull the lever back. And to hell with the consequences. This is the point in the video where I have to pause and make absolutely sure that you know that if you care about spoilers, this is the time to jump off and watch the show. It doesn't have to be the whole show, but it should, at the very least, be the first 4 episodes. I don't intend to be the one to spoil Monster for you. That would be counterproductive because I want you to watch it. However, I cannot continue to talk about Monster without spoiling the result of this dilemma, as the whole show is built around its outcome. Please know that Monster has my highest recommendation, and I honestly believe that everyone should attempt to watch the series, even if they decide later that it is not for them. So watch the first 4 episodes, then come back. It's going to take a bit, isn't it? Okay, jumping ahead. So you watched that? Cool! Welcome back. Let's continue under the assumption that you might still need convincing to watch the rest of the series, even though the first 4 episodes honestly should have done that on their own. On we go! Monster's trolley problem comes with an interesting caveat, in that Tenma was missing some key details. He was not playing a trolley problem where he knew the whole story. Instead, it's like he was playing the Cyanide and Happiness version of the game, but was not allowed to see the modifiers that could massively affect his decision. From this point on, Tenma has to come to terms with the consequences of his decisions. He has to live with the fact that, despite doing what he thought was right, despite his only crime being saving the life of a child, he would constantly meet people who have died or will die because of that one choice. It's a butterfly effect where every murder that Johan commits is just more blood on Tenma's hands. The narrative, to its credit, really likes to try and look at the situation from all angles. It's not a story that immediately comes to solid conclusions, like presuming that Tenma should not be to blame for the actions of Johan, or even that he should be. Monster is very much an advocate of the gray area, a space where there is very little good or evil, and everyone involved is just a different shade of gray. There are a multitude of arcs in Monster, more than I could cover in detail in a single episode. We have stories about lost parents, about former police and mob bosses living under new circumstances without the influence they once had. About children tormented by governmental experiments who have now grown up and have to come to terms with their experiences. Every character has an aspect of darkness to them, and almost every character is given enough spotlight to show how that darkness affects them and what it drives them to do. There are stories about veterans who care for the children of those they have killed. Stories about detectives uncovering corruption in their ranks. Stories about doctors practicing without a license because no one else will. Stories about citizens desperate for someone to fill the void left by the late Führer. And, of course, there's Johan, the boy saved by a Japanese doctor whose story affects almost every other, though he has very small amounts of screen time in order to do so. Then we come to the title, Monster. It's quite perfect when you think about it, because it's an example of a title so simple, yet complex in its meaning. Monster could lead someone to believe that the title refers to Johan, the monster who affects and influences virtually every arc in the whole narrative. And it's not entirely a false assumption, but I also feel like it doesn't cut to the heart of it. Monster, despite being singular and not plural, doesn't refer to one given person, or even necessarily a living being, but rather to the darkness inside of every character in the show, and what it can make them do. Over the course of the narrative, we eventually come to a part where characters are introduced to a children's story. It's one that's so heavily intertwined with the narrative that it's used as the visuals for the show's ED. slowly changing over the course of 75 episodes until the whole story is told. It's about a monster without a name, one who dives into the bodies of those who welcome it, giving them powers and abilities greater than what they have, only for them to be eventually devoured by it. Now, as with many stories whose main purpose is to make people think rather than telling them what to think, you can interpret this story in many different ways, all correct, but I'd like to imagine that it's the narrative's subtle way of telling us that you can let the monster take you over and reap the benefits, but that in the end, you'll end up worse off than you were before. This, of course, leads into talking about how the show handles its cast. As I mentioned before, Monster is very much about the people who are various shades of gray. There are plenty of good people who have a dark side to them, and plenty of bad people who have their own spark of light. Monster is the kind of show that will introduce you to a mob boss who treats both the general public and also occasionally his own men with disdain while enjoying steak from his ivory tower restaurant, but will also show you just what a lonely man he really is. You might, even for a brief moment, feel sorry for him and the situations that led him to become that way. You don't have to forgive his actions or agree with anything that he did, but understanding how he became this way is important. Monster, despite its more fantastical title, is not about mythological beasts or demons. It's about humans and the inherent flaws that we have, which makes us act in various ways, both good and evil. One of the narrative's recurring characters is Detective Lunge. At his introduction, he comes off like a beacon of righteousness. He is extremely studious to almost an absurd degree, and you get the sense that he values justice and the rule of law very highly. In his work, his darkness is not a corruption of his values or what he views justice to be, but is instead a misdirection of where that justice is targeted. After some time passes, Lunge soon comes to believe that Tenma is responsible for a string of murders that Tenma rightfully claims were committed at the hands of Johan. But since Johan is exceptionally good at covering his tracks, the actual evidence of his involvement makes it very easy for Lunge to come to the conclusion that Johan doesn't even exist and is perhaps a figment of Tenma's imagination. Moving further along, he is so certain in his beliefs that he disregards the little bits of evidence that Johan fails to clean up properly, because it would get in the way of the conclusion he has drawn and would interrupt the pursuit of justice that he feels is right. In this way, Lunge is not an evil character. He ends up actively working against our protagonist, Tenma, under false beliefs and false assumptions, but he is not malicious about it. He also isn't necessarily a good character, as there are many actions he takes and many things in his life he disregards in favor of his own brand of justice. Then, take the story of Eva Heinemann. First introduced as Tenma's fiancée, a woman who clearly thought very little of those outside her social standing. Her words about the value of people's lives were some that echoed in Tenma's mind as he made his initial decision to save Johan's life in the prologue. But over the course of the series, her personal arc changed in multiple ways. She first becomes a raging drunk who deeply desires revenge against Tenma, who she adamantly believes ruined her life. There are many moments when she is given the opportunity to become an obstacle in Tenma's path to redemption, and several of those she takes willingly. But the series did not always paint her in a negative light. Sometimes she could be quite warm, until the monster once again reared its head. Johan's narrative is one that is harder to nail down, specifically because the vast majority of his actions come off more as a puppet master than that of an active participant. The narrative puts Johan far more into the role of boogeyman. Our characters, and thereby we, the audience, hear tales of his deeds without being shown the vast majority of them. The actions of true evil that we see him carry out are limited. There was a part of me while watching the whole series that half expected a massive plot twist in which Johan had committed none of the crimes for which he was accused, with the few times we actually saw him murder someone being given a justifiable explanation. So much of Johan's role in the narrative is given second hand, so we constantly have to question what is real and what may be an exaggeration. It's like a bad version of broken telephone. It's hard to know what is real and what is only a rumor that someone believes to be real. In an attempt to be somewhat critical, there are also two aspects of the show as a whole that rubbed me the wrong way. While I understand their purpose and can't blame the series for utilizing these aspects, that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to like them. The first is the use of narrative coincidences in conjunction with reliance on unreliable narrators. The various arcs of Monster usually have several elements that tie the whole show together, but often those ties take episodes upon episodes to become clear. It's not uncommon for Tenma, our protagonist, to be completely absent from the narrative for several episodes, until such a time when connections are finally revealed and the pieces start to come together. Often this is done brilliantly, but other times our characters just so happen to meet the one person that they needed to find in order to progress the plot. Are you looking for a man that hasn't been seen in years? Well, you'll just so happen to meet his son, who knows exactly where he is. Do you need to interrogate a bunch of people about the involvement they had at an event from over 20 years ago? Let's pair you up with a detective from a few arcs prior who has vested interest in gaining this information, just from a different angle. Perhaps it's due to the length of this series that these types of coincidences pile up over time and start to feel a bit jarring. Though admittedly, this is very much just me nitpicking, but then we have my other pet peeve with this show. The firing of a gun in Monster is a very specific act. A very large chunk of the series is devoted to the question of whether or not Tenma will ever fire one, and if it will be because he believes that Johan has to die to correct his mistake. Guns feature in this series quite regularly, but the actual firing of them is an uncommon occurrence. My problem with the firing of a gun is that if one is fired, more often than not, it is purely for the cliffhanger effect. So many times in Monster, a character will point a gun at someone, and then the camera will cut away to another angle while the sound of a gunshot can be heard. Occasionally, this is to avoid showing the brutal murder of someone, but more often than not, it is simply misdirection. The gun that was fired wasn't actually the gun that you saw, and a very different outcome happened from what it looked like before the camera cut away. Using this tactic a couple of times works really well for building tension, especially if done at the end of an episode, forcing the audience to wait until next time to see the result. But by the end of the series, I couldn't help but roll my eyes when the camera once again cut away to an external shot and a gun went off, because I knew that the person in danger was now perfectly fine. These things are small, but I can't proceed to call this series a masterpiece, which I do believe that it is, without first acknowledging that it is not perfect, as nothing ever is. Though perfection is in the eyes of the beholder, which means the animation has a certain standard that it needs to reach. In this modern era, I honestly worry that there will be people who are turned off by any series still stuck in 4:3 DVD format, in the same way that some people prefer digital animation to analog and others can't stand to watch something in black and white. I can admit that the animation hasn't held up perfectly since its debut 16 years ago, but there are many things about the show's visuals that help offset its age. For one, the visuals are very good at helping to set up the atmosphere at any given time. Much of the narrative is depressing, dark, and not always good-natured, so to complement that, most of the art is quite bleak, with many dark browns and other earthy tones to help ground the scene in a kind of realism befitting this tale about the darker side of humanity. It has, in a way, its own unique aesthetic. The animation was produced by Madhouse, who would go on after this to produce Black Lagoon 2 years later. But at the time of Monster's airing, they were fresh off the release of Gungrave, another very story and character-focused tale about two very complicated human beings. Granted, that one dove off the deep end by its finale and almost became an entirely different show. No, it really did become an entirely different show. If you've watched Gungrave, I hope you'll agree on that. And while Madhouse has become well known for its quality in action scenes between Monster, Chihayafuru, and Death Note, The kind of character-focused works to come out of their production house is second to none. Of course, just because Madhouse produced it doesn't mean that the studio itself should get all of the credit. The show's director, Masayuki Kojima, has only directed a handful of anime in his career, and only a few since Monster. But given what he has done, it's clear that he is a very skilled director worthy of that position on almost any production. This is also the man who directed an anime in 2017 called Made in Abyss. A fact that surprised me not at all, given the subject matter of both shows. Now, if you want to talk about the creatives responsible for Monster, it would be entirely unfair of me not to mention the very name that stops the show from being almost impossible to search for on the internet. Naoki Urasawa. As with many things to try and discuss about Monster, its creator and his work could take a video all to himself, so at least let me explain one unique thing that I love about all of Urasawa's works, and how that applies to Monster. That one thing is Urasawa's use of historical settings to give a more interesting backdrop to his narratives or character backstories. Before writing Monster, Urasawa was the illustrator for the manga Pineapple Army and Master Keaton. In both works, you had backdrops of actual historical events that either were occurring or had occurred, which helped give greater depth to the world that these characters lived in. So for Monster, it takes place in Germany starting in the late 1980s, and events that occurred in Germany during that time are given great significance to the story. There is just so much real history that Urasawa pulled from, and it benefits this show so much. Though I doubt that's all he pulled from, because if you look hard enough, you might find examples of even pop culture in this work as well. For example, I fully believe Urasawa to be a fan of David Lynch. I would absolutely believe that either he, or instead maybe someone at Madhouse like Kojima, watched Twin Peaks before trying to introduce the character known as the Baby. All that's missing from the Baby's intro is him telling Nina that the gum she likes is going to come back in style. What I wish, though, that was coming back into style was more music by the show's composer. Great music for anime, in my mind, needs to accomplish two things. First, it needs to benefit the series it's composed for. The music is one major piece of the experience for the viewer. So to ignore that and just put in whatever music you want with disregard to everything else will ruin a part of that experience. Second, in my eyes, the music needs to also stand on its own, which is difficult if you're trying to accomplish that first goal. A lot of anime and a lot of media in general like to rely on soundtracks that are just good enough to suit purpose. They help move scenes along and to stop things from feeling too jarring by just having silence. Monster is one of the few that I believe is able to accomplish both of these things. My only major issue is that, well, the anime is 75 episodes in length. If you assume the average runtime of about 20 minutes after you exclude the opening and ending, that leaves you with 1,500 minutes of anime. But there's only about 90 minutes of music from the OST. Themes get repeated often, and eventually the uniqueness of the sound starts to wear off, given the repetition. So for some, it might start to get a bit stale. Unlike, of course, the show's OP. I love this OP so much for what it is able to accomplish. Not only does it contain a solid music track that I constantly listen to on its own and hate the fact that there's not a longer version, but it is also a perfect example of an OP that spoils so much about the show, and yet, without context, spoils nothing at all. It just leaves hints there for the moment when it becomes relevant and for you to go, oh, that's why it was in the OP. It's great stuff. Now, the dub of Monster, or rather comparing the dub and the sub of the series, I think is honestly an effort to compare two fairly different performances and what effects that has on your relationship with the characters. No actor, I would say, is miscast in either version. However, the performances do give characters a bit of a different air, depending on what version you are watching. Tenma is the most obvious example. In Japanese, Tenma is portrayed by the voice of Hidenobu Kiyuchi. His Tenma is very much what you would expect out of the character initially. A soft-spoken Japanese professional doing his job and trying to make the best of bad situations. This, I feel, works best for the portions where Tenma's life is more at peace, both at the start of the narrative and a bit following the time jump. Kiyuchi's voice is very much the voice of Kenzo Tenma, the doctor. It's the calm, reassuring voice of someone who is there to help. He best portrays that optimism that you'd want to see out of a character who has witnessed so much. In English, Tenma is voiced by Liam O'Brien. In contrast to Kyuchi, O'Brien's Tenma much better fits the description of lead male protagonist. In the moments when the narrative is hectic, when danger abounds, and where darkness exists in the corners just beyond the sightline of the camera, this is where his Tenma shines. O'Brien's is the voice of Kenzo Tenma, the fugitive. While he still has the ability to be a voice of reason and reassurance, there is far more of this edge of someone who has seen the depths that the darkness in the human soul can reach, and who is still wrestling with the fact that the darkness stares back. Neither of these portrayals are wrong, and I feel like they both fit the character for different reasons. But it's good to make the distinction between them because their effects on the characters and in turn the narrative as a whole can and will impact your experience while watching it. Unless you decide to watch both, of course. Now, I know that asking people to watch a series that contains 75 episodes is not an easy sell. I've also fully admitted that much of what makes Monster unique and interesting goes counter to many things that a lot of people enjoy out of their anime. But I look at it differently. I want to watch anime, and I have watched anime for many years now, very specifically because the kinds of stories able to be told in anime are not easily transferable to other mediums in this visual fashion. Sure, you can read the manga, and in this case I do recommend you to do that, but it doesn't share the same visual experience, the sounds from the production, or the passion of the voice actors. In my mind, Monster is a masterpiece because it is human. There is no supernatural entity pulling strings, even if some of the things these characters are capable of often seem fantastical. It is a series that rides an edge of morality in order to show us that everyone has the capacity for darkness, and that even the most despicable humans are still, in the end, human, which can honestly be terrifying. It is very easy to take the actions of bad people and vilify them as something other than human, because no decent human would act the way that they do. It's much harder to come to terms with the fact that, for many people, they are just one bad day away from possibly doing the same. The monster is in all of us. But who will choose to make a deal with it? And who will decide to turn it away? And there we go. Welcome to the end of the video. Firstly, let me do something that I haven't been able to do in a while, and wholeheartedly present Monster with my glass reflection rating of Certified Frosty, a rating for only the best of the best! And those shows too important to ignore, because if you ignore this, can't do anything about that. I am perfectly aware that there will be people who do not like Monster. That is fine. But I at least want people to attempt to watch it and decide that way, rather than write it off before even attempting it. Going through what I actually need to cover here in this last little section, the most disappointing thing, of course, is talking about how you can watch it. At present, as I am making this video, there is no way to watch the series legally through streaming. The series does have a history of being on streaming services. It has been on Netflix in the past, it has been on Amazon in the past, and hopefully in the future it'll be somewhere again. But right as I'm sitting here, you can't stream it. This is one of the reasons why I have taken years to do this video. Not because the video itself is hard to make, but because I didn't want to make a video about a show that I love only to tell people that they can't legally watch it. There is a couple of ways that you can technically still get by doing it legally. For example, while Viz Media, who owns the series in North America, has only ever released the first 15 episodes on DVD, and they scrapped the rest of it for some reason, which While they have only done that much, Siren Visual in Australia has released the whole series on DVD, and you can technically import that if you're able to find a copy. I do believe, though, that for them even, it is out of print, but there might be enough copies out of there that you can import it without too many difficulties. Of course, digital versions are available in weird places depending on where you live. If you were in Japan, of course, you could download the whole thing without subtitles from Amazon, and there are other places that very much depend on your region, but for North America, we're kind of not in a good place at the moment. which sucks because I really just want to tell you to go watch it and have no problems. But hey, if you listened to me at the start of the video, you already watched 4 episodes anyway. I'm not going to ask how you did that. And lastly, before I let you go, a very special thank you to my patrons, who, without your help, I would not be able to make videos on things that are not current, Monster especially. And for that, I thank you. But I do also, of course, want to give special thanks to patrons Rune Jacobson, Ryfen Bonaparte, Sid Yamako, Calhoun Boy, Hector Montemayor, and Richard Emile Bradley, because you guys are especially awesome, and I thank you. And until next time, whether that be another classic anime or maybe something more recent, watch more anime, everyone, and stay frosty.